Howdy there, friends. So as 2024 comes to a close, and I think this video is going to premiere on January 1st of 2025, actually, so hello from the past. I hope the new year's going well for you so far. But I think we can all agree that this year, 2024, was a mixed bag. And at least as far as books I read went, yeah, very mixed bag. It started off real bad. Stuff I was reading in January, February, March was not good. It was kind of entertaining in a weird way, but it was not good. It was real bad. But throughout the rest of the year, there was also a lot of stuff that wasn't bad, really, but it just didn't leave much impact. You know, I read it and then I was like, okay, that exists. And looking back, there was some truly great stuff mixed in there. Now, a lot of this I haven't talked about, particularly the stuff that just didn't leave much impact. If you want to know more about stuff I read, feel free to follow me on Goodreads. I don't write a lot of in-depth reviews on there, especially if I'm not going to do a video on it, but you'll at least know what I'm reading and a little bit about how I feel about it, but, you know, I just can't do videos on everything. But I don't have much more of an introduction than that, you know? It's been a long year, there's been a lot of books, let's just go over it and celebrate and talk about all the stuff I read this year. Once again, just to be clear, this is all the stuff that I read in 2024. It's not necessarily stuff that came out in 2024. So the dumbest thing I read this year was Wanted by Mark Millar. Now, you might be somewhat familiar with this comic because it had a movie adaptation made back in like 2007 or 2008 with Angelina Jolie and James McAvoy. It's not a good comic, and it really has nothing to do with the movie. Look, I can kind of appreciate what they were going for at some points, but overall, it was the dumbest thing I read this year. It's about how supervillains secretly control the world, and they killed off all the heroes a long time ago, and that sounds like a cool idea, but honestly, most of the story is just the main character doing pointless murder and rape all the time. That's about it. And then there's some sort of coup and a big battle for the last, like, 1.5 issues of the story, and that's kind of cool, but overall, it is just dumb. There's nothing here. It's pretending to be smart, it's trying to act smart at times, but it's just dumb. Runner-up for the dumbest book I read this year was the Chemical Garden trilogy, and there's a lot of things I could go into here. Feel free to just watch my 2-hour-long video on that series if you want to know all of the issues I have with it, but mostly, I think the thing that makes it dumb is that everyone in America is told that the rest of the world has been destroyed. It's been flooded because the ice caps melted, and the main character goes to live in Florida, and everything's fine in Florida, but entire other continents are underwater, but coastal areas are fine, and no one stops and thinks,
that doesn't make sense.
That's just one example of how dumb the Chemical Garden gets. The best setting in a book I read this year was The Peshawar Lancers. This is a book that basically no one has ever heard of, I don't think, or very few people have ever heard of. It is, I guess you'd call it alternate history. It's about a comet hitting the Earth in the late 19th century and completely reshaping the global balance of power. So then about 150 years later, we have stuff like India colonizing Great Britain. At some point, Japan conquered China and took that over, and now that whole area is just referred to as the East Asian Empire, or Dai Nippon, depending on who you ask. Russia retreated into Central Asia, and they converted to a religion that I can only describe as cannibalistic Satanism.
What is happening?
I'm not making that up. That happens. That's there. There's a steampunk computer that shows up at some point. I haven't even mentioned the inbred psychic slaves that are there. Like, most of the book isn't that weird. The actual characters and the story, like the events that happen in the story, aren't that strange, but the setting is just out there, man. And it clearly had a lot of time and effort and thought put into it as well, which I appreciated. So as strange as it is, it still feels believable in its own weird way. And overall, I just really liked it. It's not like anything I've ever seen before, and I appreciated the novelty. The neatest concept for a book that I read this year was Hell's Gate by David Weber and Linda Evans. Now, the basic idea for this is that there are 2 different separate fantasy worlds, and they have their own I guess one of them has magic, the other one has technology, but they also have psychic powers, which is basically magic. And the way that they work is completely different. And they also are multiversal. Like they find portals sometimes, and then they go through them and discover other universes. And most of these universes have been completely untouched. There's no people living there, but then at some point they run into each other, and then a war starts. And I think that just having them fight and seeing how their different technologies work off of one another is good and all, but I also really like that this is a first contact story, and we're seeing people be really paranoid and make bad decisions after that first contact, which escalates and eventually leads to the aforementioned war, as opposed to just sort of throwing them in there and then saying, okay, there's a war now. And again, I think it's a really neat concept because magic versus technology is kind of a fun idea, but also just overall really neat setup. The worst romance I read this year, or worst couple, if you would prefer it that way, would be Drake and Anya from Redemption. Remember the Critical Drinker's really fucking boring spy novel? Yeah, look, the best way I can describe this is that Anya's entire character is basically just that she gets raped a lot.
I mean, that's sexist, but okay.
And that she's tough and can punch dudes really good. And she spent her entire life just getting assaulted or having men attempt to assault her over and over again. And then she meets up with the main character, Drake, and very quickly she just decides, let's smash. I won't say that they have bad chemistry. Bad chemistry is when I feel like these characters hate each other, but I will say they have no chemistry. They feel like they exist next to each other and they're willing to work together, but they don't really feel like they're friends and certainly don't feel like they are in love with each other or anything like that. So that's like the most I can say for it. Beyond that, it's just there because, I don't know, that's how spy novels are supposed to do it. It is the worst couple from one of the worst books I read this year. Not the worst, but one of the worst books I read this year. And there's just not much I can say about it that is good. Runner-up for the worst romance/worst couple would be Kai and Payton from Powerless. The short answer for this is that one of them helped to commit a genocide against the other one's people, but it's okay because they're in love. Like, Kai is super hot and sexy, so it's okay that he killed off a bunch of people exactly like Payton.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
And Payton is fine with that until she finds out that Kai also killed her dad, and that's the straw that broke the camel's back. They're both awful people. The runner-up to the runner-up would be Ida and Callum from Brutal Prince. Basically, he's psychotic and she's meek, but he's not even over-the-top psychotic to the point where it becomes funny. He's just your run-of-the-mill violent misogynist, so it's not even fun to laugh at. He's just unpleasant, and I don't know why romance novels have dudes like that in there. I really don't. I will, however, say that, again, this is smut, so maybe I shouldn't take it that seriously. I'm still going to treat it like it's an actual story because, they write it like it's an actual book and make you pay money for it, and all its fans treat it like, no, it's romance, it's not smut. But if they're going to do that, I'm going to treat it like it's actual romance, and I'm going to treat it like it's an actual story and critique it as if it's an actual story. And from that perspective, the two of them are terrible. The best romance/couple is going to go to Christian and Lissa from Vampire Academy. Now, these two aren't the protagonists or the main characters of their own story. They are just not exactly side characters. They're still important, but they aren't the protagonist. Neither of them are. And I think because of that, and because of them not getting that much focus, that's why they work as a couple, because the main couple of Vampire Academy is really, really bad. In fact, this whole year there just wasn't much competition in this regard. But hey, Christian and Lissa, they do have actual chemistry. They mistreat each other a little bit, but that's usually done more out of misunderstandings than malice. They're just teenagers. They're not very mature yet. And for the most part, they are good to each other.
Christian, cut it out.
You know what? I will say that they are the best romance I read this year. The runner-up for the best couple I read this year is going to be Drin and the T-Rex from Taken by the T-Rex. I will not elaborate.
That's nasty.
The best nonfiction book I read this year is called They Will Have to Die Now, Mosul and the Fall of the Caliphate. And this book, I didn't read a whole lot of nonfiction this year, okay? So this book is okay. It's really just a journalist was present at the Battle of Mosul in Iraq, and he witnessed people fighting against ISIS, and he really just wrote down what he witnessed and what he heard about while he was there. And the book is okay, but I do think it will also be invaluable for future historians just because it's a primary source. You know, it's this guy literally was there and he wrote about what he saw. And in the future, as historians are piecing this together and finding new angles from which to tackle this and finding new information about it, this book is probably going to be important. There was some stiff competition for this one, but the best action scene I read this year is going to go to the final raid in The Lost Regiment, specifically the final book, Men of War. Look, there were so many things that went into making this final battle as amazing as it is. You know, the fact that there's 8 freaking books of build-up before we get there is part of it, but also the fact that we really do understand that this is humanity's last hope. If they lose here, they will all die. There will be a full-on genocide. Every human on this planet is going to die. There will be no one left after this. This is their last chance, and all they can do is launch a daring attack right into the heart of the enemy. And I don't want to give away too much there, but man, it's phenomenal. It really is. Like, every moment feels desperate. Every moment of fear and panic feels genuine because you know exactly what's at stake. It is just something else, man. I have very rarely read action scenes this good, and this one lasted a while, but it didn't last too long. It's just, oh, I can't even explain too much here. It's just really good.
But that was awesome.
But, like I said, there was stiff competition. There were a lot of really good action scenes I read this year, so I'm going to bring up some honorable mentions in no particular order. That's going to be the Battle of Suzdal, also from The Lost Regiment, but this one's from the end of the first book, Rally Cry. This one, pretty simple. The heroes are horrifyingly outnumbered, trapped in this one city, and all they have to do is hold it against an unending horde. And them doing that or failing is, again, just like in the last book, we know exactly what the stakes are here, so watching them do that is really exciting. Then there is the mocked escape in the 10,000. I kept meaning to read the sequels to this one so I could actually, you know, do something on it, and I still probably will at some point, but it's just taking me a lot longer than I wanted to. Basically, the heroes are cut off, surrounded, they don't even have any water, they're far away from a river, they're not going to be allowed to surrender. All they can do is fight their way out, and that's exactly what they do, and it works really well. The hoverboard battle from Qualify. Look, Qualify is a really dumb book, but it's really funny dumb. You know, I was just laughing and having a good time the whole time I was reading. And the hoverboard battle is basically, again, kids riding on hoverboards while other people are shooting at them, but it becomes a lot funnier when you realize that hoverboards are all controlled by singing in this book for some reason. So they're literally just going faster, ascend, descend, slower, like to move around and stuff. It becomes a lot funnier and harder to take seriously, but it's because of that it was so enjoyable to me. The Guild Raid from Dragonfired, which is the final Orconomics book. Look, Dragonfired was disappointing for me in some ways. I did a channel member and Patreon exclusive video on that if you're looking for my thoughts, but it is, yeah, not an amazing finale to this series, but this moment before we even get to the final battle is great. Like, getting the entire Heroes Guild together and launching an attack on this one dungeon is not, it's amazing. It was so much fun. I don't even have other words for it. It was just fun.
Alright, thumbs up.
Ready, guys?
Let's do this. Leroy Dragons!
Oh my god, he just ran in.
And of course, Rose versus Dimitri in Vampire Academy. This one wasn't great because of, like, the actual scale of the fighting or anything, but rather the emotional stakes. Like, Rose has spent an entire book coming for Dimitri, not to kill him out of revenge, but so she can free him from his torment and what he is unfortunately trapped as, and she's working her ass off and finally trying to see, like, will she be able to kill the man she loves and therefore save him? And it works really well. It's unfortunately retconned later in the series, but it works really, really well. The worst protagonist I read this year was Vita from Vigor Mortis. Look, Vita starts off fine. You know, I think that her powers are a little too strong, but in the first book at least, they managed to prevent it from getting out of control, so she still feels vulnerable, and she's also still pretty sympathetic at that point. But the rest of the series, she just goes completely downhill, you know? She does basically anything horrible you can think of, she does it at some point. Torture, murder, slavery, mind rape, she does all of that mostly to innocent people who did not deserve what they're getting. And also, by the end, she's just way too overpowered to actually care about anything that's going on, because we know she's just going to blast through without much effort. Runner-up for the worst protagonist I read this year is going to be Danny Wright from Divided We Fall. He has pretty much the same problems as Vita. Like, at the beginning, he's a little sympathetic, but then he is not, because he just does so much horrible stuff. You know, he also helps people, he helps people with murder and torture and slavery and ethnic cleansing. That is something that he indirectly, admittedly, he indirectly helps with ethnic cleansing, but he still does it. However, the reason that he's not as bad as Vita is because, number one, he's less overpowered. He still gets into some situations where he really should have died, and he just has plot armor, but he's less overpowered than Vita, so that helps. And in the final book, he does sort of realize that he's been working with some bad people, and he does sort of fight against them in order to stop them from doing bad stuff, but he doesn't put nearly enough effort in, and I honestly feel like the books give him far too much of a pass and never really have him grapple with the fact that he's been an awful person up until this point. So he's not as bad as Vita, but he's still one of the worst protagonists I've ever read. The most hype moment is also going to come from The Lost Regiment, and this one I have to do spoilers for, so if you don't want to get spoiled for the second to last book, A Band of Brothers, in that series, then you should skip over this section. The most hype moment from this year was Keen coming back and being revived, as it were, from The Lost Regiment. You know, in A Band of Brothers, pretty early on, Andrew Keen gets wounded, and so he spends a big part of the book just laying up in bed getting medical treatment. However, he's not back home while this is happening. He's in the middle of a besieged city. There's an entire big-ass battle going on around him. And we cut back to him occasionally, but he's really not in this book that much. In fact, the enemy straight up believes that he's dead for most of it. But when the battle is going really badly, he just stands atop the parapet so all his soldiers can see him, and then they start chanting his name. They start chanting, Keen, Keen, Keen. And then they counterattack the enemy, and the enemy sees him as well, and they think that they're superstitious as hell, so they think he literally came back to life, and they panic and they break and run, and the city is cleared and the day is saved, and he barely even had to do anything. It was just such a moment of insane hype, and I was going, yes, 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 make it happen. It was like, it reminded me of being a teenager again and watching Bleach and seeing Ichigo activate his Bankai for the first time. And I know that's maybe a stupid comparison, but that's how I felt, you know, when you're a young kid and you see something that awesome and you're just going, yeah, yeah, fuck him up, man, fuck him up. Like, that's just how I felt. And honestly, the fact that Keen is able to inspire an army like that, that says so much about him. That says how intelligent and brave and tough he really is. Which leads me to my next entry. The best protagonist I read this year is not even a close contest. It is Colonel Andrew Lawrence Keen from The Lost Regiment. This is a man who, in the prologue, his brother is killed at the Battle of Gettysburg, and he gets one of his arms blown off at that same battle. And he keeps going. He stays in the war after that because his convictions to end slavery are just that strong. And then he and all the men under his command wind up getting lost and sent to another world, and even on that other world, he's willing to risk everything for strangers because he hates slavery so much, and he believes in the ideals of democracy and freedom so, so much. He's willing to put himself in danger and lead from the front sometimes, but he's also not reckless. You know, he doesn't do anything stupid and have to be rescued by other people, which would, you know, knock him down a few pegs in terms of how good he is as a protagonist. You know, he is just a smart guy. I loved reading about him. I loved seeing his journey, and his presence is felt everywhere. Like I said, in the second to last book, he's not in a lot of it, and you feel like he's missing. You know, it feels weird to not have him there, and that's how a protagonist should be. They shouldn't just be pulled along by the story. They should be actively shaping it. And so, for that reason, Colonel Keen is the best protagonist in a book I read this year by a huge margin. The best beginning to a book I read this year is going to be in The Descent by Jeff Long. I don't even want to go into too much detail about this one. You know, I would say that if you want to check out The Descent, don't even read the summary beforehand, just read the first chapter of the book, and if you're into it, then continue. If you're not into it by the first chapter, then nothing's going to change your mind. But basically, the first chapter, it works pretty well as a standalone short story as well. It's just some people are trapped in a cave in the Himalayas, and there's a dead body in there with some weird tattoos and weird writing on it, and there's something else in there with them as well. And it doesn't look like this thing, whatever it is, just stumbled across them. It is actively hunting them. That's all I'm going to say about it. It is, one of the best openings to anything ever. The best narration in a book I read this year is going to be in The Black Tongue Thief. Now, this is told in first person, which is not unheard of for fantasy, but it is kind of rare. But, I mean, every single line in this book is just dripping with personality. You know, more so than Prince of Thorns. And the narration in Prince of Thorns is also first person, and it's also really, really good. But it just gives so much atmosphere, and it lets you know so much about the personality of the protagonist. And he's not a good person. Again, like Jorg in Prince of Thorns, he's not a good person. He's not as bad as Jorg, but he is still a thief. He's a liar. He's a crook. But even if he's a bad person, he is still an entertaining person, and that's all I ask for, really. So him having his narration and just describing everything in really unique ways, but also really colorful ways, and that gives you an idea of exactly what this world is like and what it's like for people living in it, that is genuinely great. The biggest disappointment this year was Forgotten Ruin. This one was disappointing. Yeah, this one was a little bit upsetting because I couldn't even frickin' finish it, to be honest. But it's about a group of U.S. Army Rangers getting stranded in a fantasy world, and that sounds like fun. That sounds awesome. But pretty much all of the action scenes just devolved into the characters blindly firing guns, I should say, into a mass of enemies who are just going to run at them for a while without any tactics or thought until eventually they break and run away, and the heroes are just, again, shooting at them with no tactics or thought until they eventually just run away. So all of the action's really boring, the protagonist is really boring, the way he describes things is really boring, and it's not uncommon for military science fiction to occasionally brush up against fascism, but this one just dives headfirst into it and straight up says that murdering civilian overseers who are kind of annoying is the right way to go.
Fuck off, Hitler.
It's not good. It was disappointing. You know, it wasn't the worst book I read this year, but it was the most disappointing because I had high hopes for it. The best book I read this year that took place in Colorado was Stung. And this one was pretty weird, if I'm being honest. It's about bees and vaccines turning people into zombies. Or more specifically, it's about super bees killing people and starting a flu, which kills people as well. And then the vaccine for the flu turns people into zombies, and the more doses you get, the stronger of a bee zombie you are. Look, it does not make any sense. But competition wasn't exactly stiff. You know, this book takes place in Colorado, and there are a couple of scenes in Divided We Fall which take place in Colorado, but other than that, there wasn't anything this year. One of the few things I want to bring up is that there's a character in it named Jackie, and her name is spelled like this. And I want to be upset, but also that feels like something a person from Colorado would name their kid. You know, regardless of race or religion or political orientation, you know, this could be some like weird hippie person up in Boulder. It could be some weirdo libertarian, some redneck way out in the sticks, obnoxious Christian conservatives from, well, if I'm being honest, from Colorado Springs, which is where I fucking live. But all of them feel like, yeah, they would name their kid Jackie and spell it that way. The most pleasant surprise I had when reading a book this year was Article 5. Now, this one I've spoken about a little bit in the past. I've never done a video focused just on it, but I have brought it up a few times because I read it over 5 years ago. But I never went and did the sequels, and I'm deciding to read through the whole series as of the time of this recording. I'm like halfway through book 2. We'll get more into that whenever I get around to making a video on it. But I think on reread, Article 5 is a lot better than I remember it being. You know, it's not amazing, but I remembered it being really bad and boring. It's got issues, but overall, it is more intelligent than I remembered. The characters have a bit more personality than I remembered them having, and so it was kind of a surprise, and it was a nice one. The best book I read this year, and by that I mean the best individual book I read this year, is The Descent by Jeff Long, and man, what's to say? You know, it's a horror novel. It has elements of other stuff, but overall I would say it's a horror novel, and it's the scariest one I've read in years. I mean, I haven't felt this tensed up while reading something since Metro 2033. I need to read some more stuff by Jeff Long because he is incredibly good at capturing tension and incredibly good at capturing fear and panic and making you feel like this underground world where the characters go into is simultaneously claustrophobic and a never-ending infinite void. I don't know how he managed to do it, but it is the scariest thing I've read in years, and so for that reason, it is the best individual book I read this year. The best book series I read this year shouldn't come as a surprise if you've been paying attention. It's The Lost Regiment. I mean, what's there even to say at this point? It is inspirational, uplifting, it has great characters who fight through hell and really have to earn their happy ending, it has villains who are despicable and evil, but at the same time they still have some depth and you can understand why and how they're doing what they're doing. It's just, this is a fantastic example of what military science fiction can do when the writer actually cares and has some idea or some understanding of what they're doing. Sure, it has kind of a goofy setup, but I really didn't care because the books played it completely straight. And so for that reason, it doesn't feel goofy, it feels terrifying. And it just works really well. All the tension, as I was saying before, all the moments of fear and panic feel genuine because the author commits to it and he's not afraid to have characters die, he's not afraid to have characters meet horrible fates other than death. It's just, I don't know what else to say. Read The Lost Regiment. It's fucking awesome. The most undeserved hype that a book got was Powerless. And by that I mean the book that people talked up the most and went, oh my gosh, this is so amazing, and it got really popular, but it deserved it the least, is Powerless. And overall, I would just say this book is gross. Like, there's other problems with it, which I went into in a long-ass video if you want to watch that, but overall, I would just say it's gross. As I said earlier, the main love interest is literally genocidal, and he literally murdered the protagonist's father, but you just know from the type of book it is that they're still going to be in love, and that's not going to matter, and she's going to forgive him, and in the sequels, they're going to go off together and have a happy ever after. Like, you just know that's going to happen. So I found that gross, but also, it's just lazy. And I think a good way of describing how lazy it is just by looking at some of the names for things. You know, it's a fantasy world, but rather than coming up with actual names for things, the author just sort of capitalized nouns. You know, like the people who have powers are called elites. There was a plague that swept through the kingdom a while before the story began. It's just called The Plague. You know, it's just lazy. On top of that, the book just is twice as long, or almost twice as long as it needs to be, because it has it's told from two different characters' perspectives, and most of their chapters are just repeating information that we already knew from the previous chapters. It has a very bland and boring main character who's barely even a self-insert. Like, I don't know, man. Powerless was not pleasant to get through. I hope all the sequels fail, and I hope the author learns to write something that at least feels like she's trying. And the moment many of you were probably here for is the worst book I read this year. This was also the first book I read this year, and it shouldn't shock you that much. It's Divided We Fall. Man, I think the best way to explain exactly why I hate this book so much is because I've already spent too much fucking time talking about it, and I've spent too much time thinking about it, but the best way to explain exactly why I hate it so much is just to tell you a brief synopsis about what happens. It's the protagonist murders someone, he helps to start a war by murdering someone else, he helps neo-Nazis ethnically cleanse his town, and he's the hero. You know, this isn't like Prince of Thorns or The Black Tongue Thief, where we're following a villain protagonist. We're supposed to think that Danny's the good guy here.
Ah! What the fuck?
And he has a very half-assed change of heart in the final book, but it never really goes anywhere, and he never really reconciles with his previous actions, so I'm just supposed to believe that this guy who indirectly caused the deaths of millions of people, like millions of people across the United States and abroad, die in the war that happens in this book series. Millions of them. Like, they drop nukes on New York City and Washington, D.C. Oh, but it's okay because Danny and the good guys totally didn't have anything to do with it. That was totally just some extremists. Like, it's so lacking in self-awareness, man. I didn't know it was possible for a book to be this lacking in self-awareness, but somehow it is. And there are plenty of other issues with the story, you know, like plenty of other issues with the technical details of how it's written and how the plot is structured in a weird way and stuff, but overall, that is why it's the worst, because it has one of the worst protagonists. Like I said, Vita's a bit worse, but Danny is one of the worst protagonists who causes immense suffering, is never properly called out for it, and then there's just other problems stacked on top of it. So this year was turbulent for many of us. You know, all across the world, you had governments getting thrown out of power all over the place. Mostly in elections, but also in uprisings, let's say. As of the time of this recording, it hasn't been that long since Bashar al-Assad has had to flee Syria. I wasn't expecting that, but hey, that happened. And the thing is, all these governments, some of them were left-wing or right-wing or centrist, some of them were democratic regimes, some of them were much more authoritarian, but they were all getting thrown out, and the message to be taken from that is that people all over want change. You know, we're having problems, and they're blaming their current leaders for it, rightly or wrongly, and so they're doing their best to get rid of them. And yet, in spite of people wanting change in the real world, all of the popular books seem to be exactly the same. I truly do fear for the future of publishing. I've talked about this a bit in the past, but man, I'm just worried because the less money that they're willing to invest in different genres, the more things are just going to be taken over by romantasy, which is basically just young adult, but then they also stack porn on top of it. More and more stuff is going to be overtaken by that. When they're bored with ruining fantasy, they're probably going to move on to science fiction and other genres and stuff. And I'm just genuinely worried for the future of publishing. But whatever happens, whatever problems we have in the present and whatever the future brings, no one can take the past away from you. You know, there are plenty of classics, plenty of hidden gems out there, and they will always be there. Or, unless all copies are somehow destroyed, but that's unlikely, you know? The best books I read this year were, again, The Lost Regiment and The Descent. Both of those came out in the 90s, and I don't think either of them is particularly well known. Like, I didn't ever hear about them until relatively recently, but I just came across them and said, yeah, let's try them out, and they were both amazing. And that's part of what I just started this channel to do, was not only to complain about bad books that I hate, but also to share good books that I love with people that actually care about that, because a lot of people I know in real life just aren't into this, or at least aren't as into it as I am. And that's part of what I want to do with this channel. You know, I want to help you guys discover classics, and I want to help you discover hidden gems, and I want to help you discover just whatever else might catch your fancy, you know, whatever else might bring you a little bit of joy in turbulent times. And I hope we can stay together and continue discovering stuff together for another year. And take care of yourselves and each other. I don't have a whole lot else to end with there, but I just hope you all have a lovely time. Bye. Hello, thank you for watching this far. You see all these names here? These are my patrons. My $10 and up patrons are Arthur D. Gonzalez Martin, Brother Santotis, Carolina Clay, Ikbin Longveilig, Lexi Delorme, Liza Rudakova, Lord Tiebreaker, Michael and Katie Hake, Mr. A5013, Proscriptions of Dwojang, Rovi, PsychXS, Slumbering Jellyfish, Observing Outer Space, Tesla Shark, Toa Michael, Vevictus, and Wesley. Oh, that's a bit of a mouthful. Thanks to all you guys, I couldn't do this without you. If you want to get your name on here, then consider donating. If you don't feel like donating on Patreon, you can also become a channel member. You get access to early videos and one exclusive video per month, and also just my undying gratitude. You're all great. I love you. Have a lovely day. I think this is the part where I'm supposed to say goodbye, but also don't forget to like the video, comment, and subscribe. That's all fun.